class, welcome back to our social psych chapter. In this video lecture, we're going to be talking about stereotyping. So a stereotype is a fixed, overgeneralized belief about a particular group or class of people. A fixed, overgeneralized belief about a particular class of people. And stereotyping is something that occurs automatically. It is outside of our awareness. We can draw our attention to it and become aware, but it occurs outside of awareness. And in themselves, they are neutral. They reflect efficient cognitive processes. Remember, we've said before that the brain is expensive to run. It takes up a lot of our oxygen, a lot of our calories, and so our brains are constantly looking for ways to take shortcuts. Remember the availability heuristic and the representativeness heuristic? The fundamental attribution error is actually an example of that as well. It's much less taxing to just attribute personal attributes to a reason why somebody has had something happen to them than to really think it all through. It's more efficient. So stereotypes are a manifestation of that. They really reflect an efficient cognitive process. And once they're formed, we tend to maintain them. By stereotyping, we infer that a person has a whole range of characteristics and abilities that we assume all members of that group have. Now, indeed, some stereotypes are based in truth, but they are true only on average and not even always true on average, and they're certainly not true for all people. Not all stereotypes are based in truth. So when we encounter someone who doesn't fit the stereotype, we tend not to say, oh gosh, my stereotype must be wrong. Instead, we tend to put that person in a special subcategory. This is called subtyping. So we'll say, well, all orange people are smelly, and I just met an orange person who's not smelly, and so there are some orange people who aren't. They're a subtype. That allows us to maintain the stereotype that we have that orange people are smelly. So stereotypes can become self-fulfilling prophecies. So I want you to take a look at this study. This is Rosenthal and Jacobson, 1968 and 1966. And they were looking at the effect of stereotypes on younger kids, first and second grade, and kids of lower socioeconomic status. So what they did was they went to some schools in San Francisco, and they recruited classrooms to be participants. So we've got kids in an elementary school, and they took a baseline measurement of their dependent variable. You always want to have a baseline measure of your dependent variable before and after. So they first measured that, and the dependent variable here was IQ. So they administered an IQ test to get a baseline IQ. And then they engaged in a deception, which is very common in social psych research. The teachers were then provided a list of students who were likely to, quote, show surprising gains in intellectual competence, unquote. Now, here's the thing. That was not true. Nobody has any way of knowing. There is no test that can tell you which students are likely to show surprising gains in intellectual competence. That's not possible, but they told people that. So then 8 months later, they did a post-manipulation measurement of the dependent variable. They measured IQ again. So measure IQ, tell the teachers, not the kids, tell the teachers, these kids are going to show surprising gains. They administer an IQ test, and guess what? The labeled students performed higher. So this is unbelievably surprising in a number of ways. Number one, IQ tends to be stable. Number two, the kids didn't know, the parents didn't know, only the teachers knew. So what happened? I don't know, but this is an unbelievably powerful illustration of how having a preconception about somebody can influence the way you behave with them enough to actually have an impact on something that's considered to be fairly unmalleable, like IQ. So we really, really need to be careful of our stereotypes and careful that we're not treating people based on stereotypes differently. So some of you may have been a little bit bothered by my characterization of stereotype as something that is in itself neutral. And that's because, totally understandable, that's because what comes out of the stereotype tends to be negative. So the stereotype in and of itself is a fixed, overgeneralized belief about a particular group or class of people that at its worst is not true about anybody, and at its best is true of some people, but certainly not everybody. What comes out of it, though, is where it gets really, really negative. So prejudice. Prejudice is the affective or emotional component of stereotyping. The stereotype itself is cognitive in nature. This is what you think or believe about people. But prejudice is an emotional aspect. This is negative feelings or opinions or beliefs associated with the stereotype. So if you believe that all orange people are smelly, that's the cognitive belief. And then if you now feel grossed out by orange people and don't want to be partners with them on a project or work with them or date them or whatever it might be, this is prejudice. That's the emotional part. And then there is a behavioral component, and that's discrimination, the inappropriate and unjustified treatment of people based on the groups they belong to. So if you believe orange people are smelly and then you have a negative emotional reaction toward them, and then when an orange person applies for a job with your department, you don't hire them, that's discrimination. So prejudice and discrimination are thought to be responsible for much of the conflict and warfare in the world. I will say there are other things too, land, resources, religion, those are also major factors for war as well. From an evolutionary standpoint, let me try to explain why our brains would engage in stereotyping when there's clearly such negative things that can come out of it. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is adaptive to engage in these kinds of things, even the prejudice and the discrimination, because it causes us to favor our own groups over other groups, and as a result, we discriminate against people who pose a threat to our group. So from an evolved standpoint, as we evolve, we undergo efficient cognitive process like stereotyping, and then when we say, oh, those people are other, those people are bad, I'm going to favor my in-group, then that can tighten up the in-group, cause some cohesiveness, and prevent threat from other people who may be stereotyping and being prejudiced and discriminating against your group as well. So that's how it evolves. I think in this day and age, in our multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural society, we have to just constantly be monitoring and making sure that we are watchful of our stereotypes, that we take each person in front of us as an individual and understand them in that way. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit with this evolutionary standpoint stuff that we form groups, that we form these groups and we're like, hey, my in-group is the best and I'm going to fight against the out-group. So in-group, out-group, these are social categories. So the in-group is the social group to which you belong. So you belong to TCC, you belong to your high school, you belong to your racial group, you belong to Texans, you belong to gamers, you belong to tennis players, you belong to the band kids. There's all kinds of groups that you belong to. In-group bias is the tendency to make favorable attributions toward the members of your own in-group. So you tend to say, well, we're smart and pretty and unique and kind. Ethnocentrism is one type of in-group bias. Ethnocentrism is the idea that your culture or your group is the best and that the way your group does it is the best. Sometimes people will say, let's take an extreme example. We might say, well, groups that cannibalize their own people, that is not okay. And then somebody else might say, well, isn't that ethnocentric? The cannibalism is probably serving some purpose. Maybe you shouldn't be ethnocentric about it. So I won't tell you what to believe on that, but that's the general argument. So this is one form of in-group bias. The outgroup is the social group that you don't belong to. The outgroup homogeneity effect is the tendency to see members of the outgroup as more similar to one another. We tend to say that we're good and they're bad, and we tend to say that we're all very unique and different, but the outgroup is all very much the same. So when I was in college, I was friends with several engineers. Now, they're my friends, and so we all tended to think that we were all great and very interesting and unique. But the engineers tended to see the people who were in the business school, like I was, as all kind of the same. Look the same, kind of act the same, and the people in the business school where I was tended to look at the engineers and say, well, they're all kind of the same. They look the same, they act the same. So these are natural processes that happen for good or ill, where we tend to think that we're good and the others are bad, that we're all very unique and different, but the others are all very similar to one another. So in-group bias, let me give you some more examples of this. Again, the tendency to make favorable, positive attributions for behaviors by members of your in-group and unfavorable, negative attributions for behaviors by members of the out-group. So we succeeded because we worked hard, but they succeeded because they just got lucky. Okay? We failed because of circumstances beyond our control. They failed because they're stupid and incompetent. We're intelligent, they're sneaky. These are the kinds of things we do when we engage in in-group bias. So ethnocentrism is one form of in-group bias, the belief that our culture or ethnic group is superior to others. Okay, the Robbers Cave experiment. This is a classic study in in-group, out-group bias. So this was conducted with 11 to 12-year-old boys at a camp. The camp was actually called Robbers Cave. It's actually just over the Oklahoma border from us, just a few hours away. And the boys were divided into two groups, and they were kept separate from one another. In fact, they didn't even know that there were any other kids at the camp. They thought they were the only ones. And then at some point, the researchers arranged for the groups to meet in a series of competitive games. And once they started doing that, a fierce rivalry quickly developed, demonstrating the ease with which mutually hostile groups could be created. All kinds of nasty incidents started to occur. They didn't know other people were there, but then they would go down to their swimming hole and they would see trash and they were like, hey, somebody's, ruining our swimming hole. Who could it be? And they sort of began to discover, oh, there are other people here. And then they began to be pitted against each other in like archery and swimming and building things. And they began to be real fierce rivals. And each group took on characteristics of a very distinct social group. They had leaders, they had rules, they had norms of behavior, they had nicknames. One group was called the Rattlers, for example. They had a flag, they had a color, they had a slogan that stood for who they were and what they were all about. So now you've got these two groups that have formed some group norms. You very much got in-group, out-group bias going on. Nasty things started to happen. They started to try to hurt the other group. So then at this point, now that this has sort of naturally developed, remember the researchers are running this. They set this up. They put the two boys together. They let just some awareness, and then they created these competitive games. Now you've got hostility and rivalry. And then they wanted to try to diffuse it. And so they started to have the boys come together just through simple contact, like they're all going to eat together in the mess hall at the same time. And they were wondering if that might reduce hostility, and it did not. Harmony between the two groups was eventually achieved, but here's how they did it. The people running the experiment sabotaged the truck that was driving in to bring their food. They sabotaged it. They made it break down, and then they gave one of the groups part of what was needed to fix the truck, and the other group had part of what was needed to fix the truck. Now this is all unbeknownst to the boys. They don't know that they've been given this thing, okay? But they discover, oh, I've got this thing, but I need something else. And then the other group discovers, oh, I've got this thing, but I need something else. And so then at that point, the two groups had to cooperate in order to achieve the common goal of fixing the truck so that they could get their supplies, so they could eat. And then at that point, once they worked together, they formed an in-group all together on their own, and the hostility and the rivalry dissipated. Isn't that wild? So working together toward a common goal was the key. Now, there's a lot of criticism of this study. This was all boys. It was all white middle-class boys. It's possible that this may not have worked had there been, had the groups not been so homogeneous. But it did work, and other people picked up on this idea, and they picked up on it, and they called it the jigsaw classroom. So they adapted the Robbers Cave techniques to a newly integrated school. And so Aronson in 1992 brought together students in a small, ethnically diverse groups to work on a mutual project. And each student had a unique contribution to make toward the success of the group. So interdependence and cooperation replaced competition, and this is called the jigsaw classroom technique. So kids who were in jigsaw classroom techniques where they had something they had to contribute for the good of the group had higher self-esteem, higher liking for other children and other ethnic groups than the traditional classrooms did. There was less negative stereotyping, less prejudice, and a reduction in intergroup hostility. So what Aronson says is that cooperation changes our tendency to categorize the outgroup from those people to we people. So what this research is indicating is we have to move from us versus them, in-group, out-group, to we're all in it together. So very, very interesting stuff. All right, that's a very brief take a look at stereotyping. And in the next video, we will talk about another in-group, out-group situation, politics and moral psychology, and why the political left and right can't see eye to eye. I'll see you then.